For more than 30 years, Americans thought they knew Jay Leno, the man with the denim shirts, the easy laugh, the gentle voice that tucked millions into bed every night. But behind that familiar smile lived a truth he kept, buried so deep that even the people closest to him never saw it. A truth that only came to light after fire, blood, and heartbreak forced the mask to fall. Jay wasn't just living one life. He was living two, and both were killing him slowly. It's hard to imagine now, but long before the fame, before the Tonight Show chair, before the cars and the contracts, Jay Leno was a quiet kid sitting on the cold floor of a Massachusetts garage. While other children played outside, Jay spent hours dismantling old engines, with the kind of focus most people don't gain until adulthood. To him, the world made sense only when he could take things apart, understand them, and put them back together again. What no one realized then was that this habit would become his refuge, his escape, and eventually the second life he would hide from millions. At school, teachers thought he was a distraction. Too funny, too talkative, too busy trying to make people laugh to pay attention to anything else. On one of his report cards, a teacher wrote a sentence so prophetic it feels scripted. If Jay spent as much time studying as he does trying to be a comedian, he'd be a big star. Jay didn't study more. He simply leaned into the chaos, letting humor become the armor he didn't know he'd need. By the time he reached Emerson College, he was already living two separate identities without knowing it. In the mornings, he fixed cars in a small Boston garage, covered in grease and engine oil. At night, he slipped into smoky bars to test comedy routines in front of strangers, shaping a voice that would soon define late-night television. Neither side of that life was glamorous. Neither came with guarantees. But together they kept him alive. They gave him purpose, structure, control. Things he never found in school or in the unpredictable world outside. After graduating in 1973, he packed his entire life into a beat-up car and drove across the country to Los Angeles. No money, no backup plan, no safety net. The Comedy Store became his second home, its lights casting shadows he would eventually learn to hide inside. But the truth is, Jay didn't live in Los Angeles the way most people did. While other comedians chased fame with reckless abandon, Jay split his days with surgical precision. He worked long shifts in a Burbank garage to make rent. Then he worked late nights on stage to make his dream real, covered in grease by day, swallowed in laughter by night. Two worlds, one body, no rest. But what no one knew, not then, not in the decades that followed, was that this double life wasn't ambition. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't even a hustle. It was survival. Jay Leno didn't need the garage for income. He needed it because it was the only place on earth where he wasn't being watched, judged, or celebrated. It was the only space where the world became quiet. He once joked that cars were the only things that could make him stop talking. What he didn't say was that they were also the only things that made his anxious mind stop spinning. Then came March 2nd, 1977, the night Jay Leno walked onto The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. America saw a rising star. Hollywood saw a new contender. But Jay saw something entirely different. He saw a future where he'd have to keep living two full lives just to stay sane. Performing on stage made him feel weightless. Working in a garage made him feel grounded. One life fed his ego. The other fed his soul. He couldn't choose, so he didn't. He carried both. By the time the 1980s arrived, Jay was working harder than anyone in comedy. Over 300 shows a year, thousands of miles traveled, no breaks, no excuses, no sleep. He became known as the hardest working man in show business. But the truth was far darker. Jay wasn't working hard because he loved the grind. He was working hard because he feared what might happen if he ever stopped. Movement was his medicine. Stillness was the enemy. When NBC eventually named him Johnny Carson's permanent guest host, his life changed forever, but not in the way viewers imagined. The fame got louder. The expectations got heavier. The spotlight grew hotter. But Jay's other life, the one in the garage, grew even darker, more secretive and more necessary. Each night after taping The Tonight Show, after making millions laugh, after interviewing the biggest stars in the world, Jay drove straight back to Burbank and disappeared into the smell of oil and metal, alone, unseen, unmasked. To the rest of the world, he was becoming a legend. To himself, he was still that boy in a garage, trying to fix things no one else could understand. And he was about to enter a chapter of his life that would test both versions of himself in ways no one, not even Jay, was prepared for. As Jay Leno stepped deeper into the world of late-night television, people assumed he had everything figured out. The charm, the jokes, the timing. It all looked effortless. But behind the curtain, Jay was still juggling two entire worlds, each demanding more from him than any outsider would ever understand. While the cameras made him appear invincible, the truth was that every night he walked onto that stage, he carried years of exhaustion, discipline, and the echoes of a childhood that trained him to never stop moving. He wasn't performing for fame. He was performing to keep the pieces of his life from collapsing. When NBC announced Jay as the permanent guest host of The Tonight Show in 1987, it felt like destiny. But destiny didn't come softly for him. It arrived with pressure, expectation, and a spotlight bright enough to expose every insecurity he tried to bury. People saw the confidence, but they didn't see the man who avoided parties, who avoided alcohol, who avoided anything that could slow him down. To Jay, stillness was danger. Stillness meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering things he spent a lifetime trying to outrun. By the time he took over The Tonight Show in 1992, the war between his two worlds reached a breaking point. On one side, Jay was being shaped into an icon, the man the country trusted to tuck them into bed with laughter. On the other side, he was still that quiet mechanic from Andover, turning wrenches until his knuckles split, finding comfort in the hum of an engine when the noise of fame became too loud to bear. Fame wanted him to become larger than life. The garage reminded him he was human. The world remembers the headlines, the so-called feud with David Letterman, but the world never saw what it did to him internally. Accusations, backstabbing rumors, tabloids ripping him apart for a man who avoided conflict his entire life. The backlash cut deeper than any critic could imagine. Jay didn't fight back. He didn't give long interviews. He didn't defend himself. He simply went back to work because working was the only language he understood. Night after night, he refined every joke, every pause, every facial expression until audiences slowly found their way back to him. And when they did, they stayed. By the mid-90s, Jay wasn't just a comedian. He had become a symbol of America entering the late-night hours. A man who never stumbled, never complained, never changed. But that consistency came with a cost. After each taping, when the applause faded and the cameras powered down, Jay returned to Burbank. Not to celebrate, not to relax, but to put on the same oil-stained overalls he'd worn for years. He would work on engines until midnight, long after the studio parking lot emptied. People said he was eccentric. People said he was obsessed. People said he was living in a fantasy world of machines and nostalgia, but none of them understood why. The garage wasn't a hobby. It was a sanctuary, a place where his mind could go quiet, a place where each bolt and piston obeyed rules that never changed. Unlike the entertainment industry that could betray you overnight, Jay wasn't hoarding cars. He was building a refuge, one wrench turn at a time. As his fame soared, so did the weight he carried. His schedule became punishing. He taped 5 nights a week, flew out for weekend stand-up gigs, then flew back in time for Monday rehearsals. He slept 4 hours a night. He never complained. He never snapped. He never slowed down, because slowing down felt like stepping into a darkness he didn't want to face. Everyone saw the superstar. No one saw the toll. But success only made his double life more visible. With every car he restored, every motorcycle he brought back to life, every late-night set he performed when everyone else went home, Jay was slowly revealing the truth, that beneath the polished smile was a man terrified of losing momentum, a man whose identity was split between the applause that kept him functioning and the engines that kept him sane. And then came the years when Jay became untouchable. The Tonight Show dominated ratings. Millions tuned in. His face appeared on billboards, magazines, award stages. But even then, especially then, he refused to take a single vacation. He refused to spend his Tonight Show salary. He refused to slip into the comfortable life that fame offered, because he knew something that the world didn't. Comfort makes you slow. Slowing down makes you vulnerable. And vulnerability was the one thing Jay Leno had spent his entire life avoiding. What no one knew was that the pressure he put on himself wasn't sustainable. And soon the cracks, the ones he tried to hide behind the machines and the laughter, were about to turn into fractures. The very discipline that made him a legend was slowly consuming him from the inside. And before long, the man who had spent decades outrunning everything, pain, fear, exhaustion, would face the one thing he could never escape, his own limits. Even as Jay's world tilted in ways he never expected, the outside world still saw the same man, the comedian who never canceled shows, the mechanic who never missed a day in his garage, the entertainer who somehow seemed ageless. But behind the calm public grin, behind the perfectly timed punchlines and the scent of engine, oil that clung to his clothes, Jay was living inside a storm he no longer had the strength to hide from, and yet he kept pretending that the two lives he spent decades balancing were still intact, pretending that he wasn't unraveling, pretending that nothing, absolutely nothing, could break him. But everyone has a limit. For years, his double life had been his power. Television kept him sharp, comedy kept him grounded, and machinery kept him centered. But now all of it, every piece of who he once was, began colliding in ways he couldn't control. His accidents had left scars deeper than burns and broken bones. His heart issues reminded him that time was no longer his ally. But the deepest wound of all was watching the love of his life dissolve into a world where he could no longer follow her. Every morning, Jay woke up before sunrise and stood quietly in the doorway of their bedroom, watching Mavis breathe, watching the woman he shared 4 decades of life with, hoping today would be one of the rare days when her memory held long enough for them to share a few minutes of clarity. And sometimes they did. Sometimes she smiled in a way that seemed to remember every version of him. Comedian, mechanic, caretaker. Other days she searched his face as if he were a stranger, but Jay never let her see the heartbreak. He smiled, he joked, he made her laugh because laughter was the one language dementia couldn't erase. Their marriage had once been built on adventure, travels, premieres, book events, quiet vacations. Now it was built on simple moments, feeding her soup, brushing her hair, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of timelines she no longer understood. And through it all, Jay kept working, not because he wanted to, but because he needed the money for her care, needed the routine to keep himself from falling apart, needed something, anything, to keep him steady as his world slipped into the kind of silence no engine could drown out. Audiences noticed the subtle change. His jokes were still sharp but softer. His energy was still strong but different. There was a heaviness behind his eyes that even the brightest stage lights couldn't erase. Fans whispered. Reporters speculated. But Jay kept smiling, because he had been hiding pain for so long that it had become muscle memory. And yet, something inside him had shifted forever. The garage, once his sanctuary, now felt different. The engines he could once restore blindfolded moved slower beneath his hands. Late at night, alone among the metal giants he had collected across decades, he found himself lingering between cars as if searching for something he had misplaced years ago. But he knew the truth. It wasn't the machines he was losing. It was time. Time with Mavis, time with his own health, time with the person he used to be. The world still celebrated him as a legend, one of the hardest-working entertainers in American history. But Jay no longer cared about legends. He cared about moments, small ones, precious ones, ones that were slipping away faster than he could hold on to. And yet, even in the middle of heartbreak, life had one more twist waiting for him. Something quiet, something unexpected, something that would force Jay Leno to confront the truth he had spent decades avoiding, that the double life he had built wasn't just about work, cars, or comedy. It was about running from stillness, running from vulnerability, running from the one thing he could never joke away. And now, for the first time, he could feel the chase ending. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world finally stops spinning and the lights of Hollywood fade into the distance, Jay Leno sits beside the woman who once walked red carpets with him, debated politics fearlessly, and laughed at jokes long before the cameras ever did. Now she rests with her hands gently folded, her eyes soft, her memories drifting like fading photographs. And Jay, the man who lived his entire life at full throttle, learns a different kind of patience, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, the kind that doesn't end with laughter, the kind that tests the very soul of a person. For decades, he outran everything: failure, exhaustion, accidents, even the expectations of an industry that watches its stars as closely as a surgeon watches a heartbeat. But now, in the final stretch of his life story, Jay no longer runs. He stays, he sits, he listens. He repeats the same stories gently, not because Mavis remembers them, but because she remembers him. And that to Jay is enough. His garage sits a few miles away. The cathedral of engines, the empire of steel he built from childhood dreams. But it no longer defines him. The roar of a V12, the hiss of steam, the low purr of a perfectly tuned carburetor. They still matter. But they don't matter most. Not anymore. For the first time since he was a boy in Andover, wiping grease from his hands with a towel his mother told him not to ruin, Jay Leno has allowed himself to slow down. Not because he's tired, but because love demanded it. And yet, even in the softness, the world sees a man unbroken. Fans still stop him in grocery stores, still tell him jokes, still thank him for decades of laughter. And Jay smiles, not because he's trying to be Jay Leno, but because he genuinely, quietly still loves people. He always has. But now he moves through life with a different kind of gratitude, a different rhythm, a different purpose. His double life, the comedian who never stopped working and the mechanic who found peace in engines, has merged into one final identity, a husband who refuses to leave the woman who can no longer follow him through the fog of fading memories. He cooks for her, he brushes her hair, he guides her gently across the living room floor, turning chores into dances, turning heartbreak into devotion. People often ask him privately, "How do you stay so strong?" Jay just shrugs. Strength never felt like something he chose. It felt like something life demanded. From the boy who couldn't sit still, to the host who carried the weight of late night, to the man who now carries the weight of goodbye. But here's the truth no one saw coming. Jay Leno is not simply enduring this chapter. He is mastering it, the same discipline that kept him alive through explosions, crashes, and a failing heart. Is the same discipline he now uses to wake up each day and take care of the woman who once took care of him, not out of duty, but out of a love that has outlived fame, outlasted illness, and remained untouched by time. The engines in his garage will one day cool. The cameras that once pointed at him will fade into archive footage. The laughter of millions will echo through reruns and memories. But the real legacy Jay Leno leaves behind is not measured in ratings or cars or punchlines. It's in devotion. It's in loyalty. It's in the quiet heroism of showing up every single day for someone who can't always show up back. And maybe that's the chapter he never meant to reveal, the private truth behind the public life, the final proof that even the strongest engines eventually slow, but the strongest hearts never do. Jay Leno spent decades building a world powered by motion, but in the end his greatest act was learning to stand still, hold someone's hand, and love them through the one battle he could not repair, outrun, or rewrite. If this story touched you, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next story is already on its way.